Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Hello all, and welcome to tonight's presentation from the Bay Area Skeptics. My name is Josh Rhodes now, and I'm excited to welcome you all. I want to tell, we'll talk more about this later, but we do have a speaker coming up next month. Our October speaker is Peter Hadfield, Potholer54 on YouTube. Some of you may know him already, and that's going to be a great talk. I'll mention a little bit more about it when we get to the end here, but I want to preview that. I'm very excited to welcome today Michael Worobey as our speakers, talking us about the origins of the COVID pandemic. Worobey is the professor and the head of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Arizona, originally from British Columbia, where he's working on building his retirement home now. He received his Ph.D. from the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford in 2001, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He uses the genomes of viruses to trace the evolution of major communicable diseases and to understand their origins, emergence, and control. He's made seminal discoveries in pinpointing where, when, and how HIV originated and spread worldwide, and how pandemics like the 1918 Spanish flu and COVID have emerged and killed large numbers of people. His work is regularly published in respected journals like Science and Nature, and is the subject of multiple books and films, including Spillover and the Rise of the Killer Virus. Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much. And just to be clear, I'm building my cabin on the west coast of Vancouver Island, starting with a huge pile of cedar logs and milling them into timbers. So I do not expect to be retiring for 25 years maybe, if I can pick up the pace. Okay, let's get in.
And we didn't plan this, but it's apropos that this week there's a new COVID vaccine approved, and it seems like we're in the midst of another surge of infections. So this is not a topic that's going away anytime soon. So we're glad to have you here and to learn more about what got us into this and maybe how to prevent the next one.
Absolutely, yeah, that's actually where I end up. And can you hear me okay, Josh?
Yes, I hope everyone else can too.
All righty. So I'll just get started with a quote that from a colleague and friend of mine that kind of took me by surprise, because not super early on, but longer than some of my colleagues who are in the business of trying to use gene sequences from viruses and other information to figure out when, where, and how pandemics started. I remained open to the idea that perhaps this wasn't a natural origin, and maybe there was something to this idea that it had escaped from a lab. And so David was quoted saying that I have a soft spot for wild theories. And when I thought about it, I thought, okay, maybe that's kind of true, because I did in 2000, exactly, the sort of new year of 2000, I did travel to the Congo with the eminent late Bill Hamilton, often described as the most famous Darwinist since Darwin. Bill had a real soft spot for the idea that the HIV/AIDS pandemic started with work involving research, in this case, into vaccines for polio. There had been a station in the 1950s in the jungle near Kisangani in the eastern Congo, where work was done developing experimental live polio vaccines. And so Bill and I made a trip there in 2000 to try to get at this hypothesis by looking to see if the chimpanzees that still lived in the local area, whose ancestors had been collected and used for studies of whether the vaccines they were making were safe, still harbored relatives of HIV-related viruses. And to cut a long story short, HIV, the main pandemic lineage is up at the top here, this group M. And it turns out it's in a whole separate branch of the evolutionary tree of these viruses than what I was able to, 3 years later when I went back, collect and pull out of a fecal sample from a chimp. And so in this case, we were able to say, well, maybe it could have happened that way, but no, the animals there that were supposedly the source of the virus only have a very distant cousin relationship to HIV. And in fact, there have been chimpanzees sampled in southeastern Cameroon now that are clearly the source of this outbreak. Just following up on the HIV side of things to set the stage for tonight, a follow-up piece of work that I did where I screened old formalin-fixed, paraffin-embedded tissue samples that had been collected in the Congo in 1960, revealed that there was actually a lot of diversity of the virus in Kinshasa already by 1960, and almost definitely the origin of the outbreak was somewhere right around the turn of the 20th century. And this one figure that I'm going to show you from the paper shows on the y-axis, you're looking at the population size of basically all of the good-sized towns and cities in that Central African region from 1880 to 1970. And what you'll notice in this gray area, which is the window when the viruses are telling us they first were certainly circulating in humans, this coincides with just the very first existence of these cities. They were all founded not long before that and just slowly started to gain appreciable size. And then boom, you have HIV taking hold. And this is a theme that we're going to look at with COVID as well, where it's not just the opportunity for these viruses to jump in from wild animals that make a pandemic. It actually takes a city, to riff on the "it takes a village" line. For many of these things, you have to have people in high density for it to have a chance of becoming a pandemic. Okay, so let's go through some of the milestones of this current pandemic. And for a lot of people, it was right at the end of December or very, very early in January that we became aware of this. Part of that was because the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission in Wuhan, China, where the earliest cases were noticed, put out a public press release on the 31st of December saying that there was a cluster of pneumonia of unknown etiology. So pneumonia cases where you can't figure out why they have pneumonia because they don't have flu or RSV or bacterial infections. And so this was the first sort of clue that the rest of the world had that something was going on. But actually, December 30th was when it really started reaching and leaking into the outside world. So on the 30th, the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission put out a confidential notice to all relevant medical institutions in the city, saying that the Huanan market, a seafood, nominally a seafood market, had witnessed patients suffering from a pneumonia of unknown cause, and every institution in the city has to thoroughly investigate and provide stats of patients suffering from pneumonia of unknown cause in the past week. This leaked within 11 minutes and started circulating in Chinese social media. And interestingly, the local authorities had not communicated to national authorities that this was going on. And so the Director General of the Chinese CDC, George Gao, instead of learning about it through official channels, actually learned about it by surfing the web late in the evening of the 30th of December. Okay, so let's have a little bit of background on Wuhan. So a lot of people had never heard of Wuhan before this pandemic, but it's one of the most populous cities. It's the most, in China, the most populous city in central China, a population more than 12 million people, and it puts it in the top 10 in China. And so I want you to just bear in mind for this whole talk, what a huge place this is. It's 1.5 times the size of the 5 boroughs of New York City in population. A huge place that has a whole lot of locations where you might notice the first cluster of a respiratory infection. And so I'm sure you remember from back in those early days that one of the first things that we learned about this was that a very large percentage of the earliest reported COVID cases worked at just one location in this huge city. Something, close to 50% of the very first cases that were noticed worked at the Huanan market. And so if you again think about all of the places that this could have emerged, if it didn't actually start at the Huanan market, we have to think about, what are the chances that it would pop up there as opposed to some other place. Okay, so March 29th, 2021 was another big landmark day in the understanding of the pandemic. And that was when a report was released by the joint investigation of a WHO mission that went to China for about a month, had to quarantine in hotels for half of it, but then met with Chinese scientists, public health people, authorities of all sorts, and they put out this joint report, and the headline from that was "Virus origins remain unclear." But one of the things that was a bit of a curveball to me when that report came out, again thinking that that maybe this started because that market sold live wildlife, was this quote here: "Market authorities have confirmed that no illegal trade in wildlife has been found. No verified reports of live mammals and no verified reports of live mammals being sold around 2019 were found." And so for me, this kind of made me think, okay, well, maybe it is just sort of a weird coincidence. I thought probably this place sold some of the animals like raccoon dogs and civets that were infected with viruses related to the first SARS coronavirus 20 years before. But maybe it's just a weird coincidence. Not too long after, a few months later, a Chinese team working with folks from the University of Oxford dropped this bombshell of a paper, Animal Sales from Wuhan Wet Markets Immediately Prior to the COVID-19 Pandemic, where they reported, well, actually, we've been going around to the only 4 markets in this big city that had sustained sales of live mammals like raccoon dogs and civets and others. And the Huanan seafood market is one of them. And in fact, it was the biggest of these markets in this city. So I want to just now take you from where I am here in Tucson, and we're going to zoom across the Pacific and then start to zoom in on China and then Hubei province where Wuhan is, and then within Wuhan, the Huanan seafood market, which occupies these 2 buildings on the either side of a road. The left one is about the size of a Canadian professional football field, which is a little bigger than a US one. Okay, so I've said a very, very percentage. I got excited there. That should say a very large percentage, again, of the earliest reported COVID-19 cases worked at the Huanan market. And again, it turns out to be only one of 4. And so, nevertheless, when I started thinking about whether you could rule this place out as the origin of the pandemic, I started with this idea that, maybe it's like the drunk man looking for his lost keys under the lamppost at night because it's the only place where the light is good. And so the question I had was, okay, were those cases found predominantly there only because that was the main place people were searching for cases? And this was not a crazy idea. That, again, the first SARS outbreak tied to wildlife markets and other places that sold wildlife. H7N9 influenza, that was the kind of place that people expected these pandemic viruses to jump from animals into humans. And I actually had a friend and colleague who had pretty close connections with Chinese researchers and public health folks who said, no, don't make anything at all about this association with the Huanan market. It's because China had this big program to try to find cases of pneumonia early on, and they concentrated on looking at live animal markets. And so probably the virus was already widespread in Wuhan in December of 2019, but all the focus was on this market. And so I thought, okay, if that's the case, then we could really poke a hole in this idea that the outbreak started at this market. And so I then spent the next 4 months or so, mostly here in my basement where I am right now, trying to learn every single thing I could about the early outbreak, not just from reading all the scientific papers, both in Western journals, but also obscure ones in Chinese journals, but reading news reports, digging off of, the web archive, some of these reports that had gone out by Chinese public health officials before the pandemic was even known by the national authorities, and just trying to line up every possible thing I could. And I ended up sort of peeling the layers of the onion back until I could get to a point where I knew that ascertainment bias could not be a factor. Ascertainment bias, again, being this process of, you end up with an observation, but it's only because that's the only place you were looking for any observation. And so it turns out that this doctor here, Dr. Zhang Jixian, who was a respiratory specialist at a hospital fairly near the Huanan market called the Hubei Provincial Hospital of Integrated Chinese, Traditional Chinese and Western Medicine. And what happened with her is that on December 27th, she saw CT scans from 2 patients who had come in the day before who had pneumonia and were not doing super well. And she looked at them and thought, you know, those look a little bit like the SARS cases that I was familiar with 2 decades ago. And they were with their son, who was ostensibly healthy, but she said to the son, you need to have a CT scan as well. He thought she was just trying to, you know, put a little extra money in the coffers of the hospital, but eventually relented. And it turned out, though he was feeling well, that his lungs were full of these same lesions, and he was walking around with severe pneumonia as well. And so at that point, on the 27th of December, she figured that there was probably a new pathogen, maybe related to SARS. It was transmissible human to human because it had infected all 3 members of this family, and that's almost, you know, that's very likely due to them passing it to each other. And that you could also be asymptomatic and walk around and think you're totally fine, but be spewing virus all over the place. And unfortunately, none of those lessons really sank in until the 22nd of January, almost a month later, when the Chinese authorities said, okay, there is human-to-human transmission, and we're going to put the largest cordon sanitaire that's ever existed in humanity around this city to try to prevent the virus from becoming a pandemic, which was too little, too late. And so it turns out that what she observed at her hospital before anyone had an inkling that this pandemic may have started at a wildlife market were these 3 cases, which it turns out didn't work at the market. But once she was on the lookout, 1, 2, 3, 4, the 4 next patients that came into her hospital all had the same syndrome, and each of them worked at the Wuhan market. And so at that point, on December 29th, she and the administration of her hospital got in touch with local, with municipal and provincial public health authorities and said, hey, we think there's a new thing spreading or at least circulating in the city. And it appears to be linked to this one workplace, this one location, the Wuhan market. They also, the administrator of the hospital, before calling the public health authorities, had the idea of calling around to some other hospitals that were not too near the Wuhan market. And sure enough, they said, well, you know what, we are seeing pneumonia of unknown etiology. And it turns out that most of our cases are people who worked at the market as well. And this includes hospitals that were far, far away from the market and right close to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which some people have proffered is the place that this virus actually started circulating in humans. So we can rule out the idea that it's just a mirage, it's just something due to looking in a more concentrated way at this market. And so the next thought I had was that I knew there was some geographical information that about where some of the earliest onset cases of this COVID-19 outbreak lived in China. And I thought, well, maybe I could still rule out the Wuhan seafood market as the source of this outbreak, if it turns out that geographically, the cases that didn't have an epidemiological link to the market, didn't work there, didn't visit, didn't know anyone who did, were dispersed throughout the whole city, or even were concentrated around some other possible location like the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which importantly was not a place that any one of the earliest onset cases worked. There are no documented cases that were popping into hospitals who worked at this institute. Again, despite the fact that early on, no one was particularly looking for any location or not. And so this is published in 2022, so came out in July of last year. And this ended up being, so I went from working out the ascertainment bias thing by just isolating myself and working on my own for months. And for this question, was fortunate enough to put together a big team and join up with Christian Anderson, who was also working not on the residential location issue, but the issue of where the virus might have been within the many stalls of this market early on. And so these are some of the early career researchers that worked on this, including Lorena Malpica, who's in my lab. And here are some of us older folks. And so the first breakthrough that I had was, even though for months and months and months, I had been looking at data like this from the WHO China report on the investigation, I wasn't able to really make any use of it. And so just for the moment, ignore these smaller dots and look at these bigger dots. Okay, so this comes from a map that was published in the report, very low resolution, where case locations, case residences were indicated by these larger dots that are about 2 kilometers in diameter. And so once you get out of the center of Wuhan, you can discern individual dots reasonably well. But in the center, it's just a sort of blob of color. You can't make out individual cases. To cut a long story short, I realized that buried in a different part of the WHO report entirely was a tiny little map that didn't have any references to geographical locations and was just sort of floating in space without seeming to be of much use. When I overlaid that map onto the other map with the big fuzzy blue and orange dots, it turned out that you realize that, oh yeah, these actually are mapping the same cases in central Wuhan, and especially in this area here, you can actually make out most of the cases. So of the 174 cases with the earliest onset reported, I was able to recover, well, there were 164 of them within Wuhan municipality proper, and I was able to get 155 of them. So here's a little map of some of the places that you will have heard of. Huanan Market is here on the north side of the Yangtze. The older Wuhan Institute of Virology of campus is here on the south side, and way down south is the relatively new biosafety level 4 lab. And so let's have a look at the data that I was able to recover, because Chinese scientists and public health people were able remarkably to collect this kind of residential information. And so here's in orange cases who we know worked at the market or had contact with the market or visited the market. Pretty non-random, and this is actually just a pretty small piece of Wuhan. It extends out in all directions for, you know, about 40 miles. And this is a 5-kilometer bar here. But, you know, certainly an association with general area of the market. And here now is adding in cases that had no history of exposure at the Huanan market. And so you don't need a ton of statistics to see a pattern here that the early cases really do seem to be clustered quite heavily around the market. However, you can't just go by the general pattern because you don't know if that's actually just where all of the people live, if that's the highest density part of the city and hardly anyone lives over here, for example. And so we were able to draw on that kind of information from demographic data that's publicly shared in a sort of 100-meter by 100-meter grid across this 8,000 square kilometer city. And this is just actually before we even go into those statistics. This is what you get when you take all of that data and sort of summarize it as the areas with higher and higher probability of drawing a case early on. And it turns out that the very highest area of based on the pattern of where early cases lived, of finding an early case, if you were able at that point to go out and find all of them, was this ridiculously small bubble with the Huanan market right in the middle of it. And again, there's only 4 markets that sell wildlife in the city in a sustained way. The Huanan is the biggest one. And here we have data that has nothing to do with the Huanan market. So these are cases that were unlinked to the market. They were not collected in a way that would link them to the market, and yet the market's right in the middle. So to me, this is probably the most important information that we have indicating that this virus really did get its start at that market. And so just to follow up with the statistical analyses, if you ask, are they actually closer to the market than can be expected by chance based on the population density of the city? The answer is a resounding yes, highly, highly unlikely. And again, if people aren't doing stats every day, this is just a way that you assess, could this pattern based on where people live been so clustered and close to the market just by chance? And you would expect that fewer than 1 in 1,000 times, unless there really was a connection to that market or somewhere close by. And are the cases actually centered around the market? And again, very, very highly statistically significant evidence that that's the case. Just a quick vignette, as I mentioned, even hospitals far from the market and close to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, like the Jiangnan Hospital, which is somewhere around here, showed the same pattern. So at Jiangnan, 15 kilometers away from Huanan, the vice president, Yuan Yufeng, early on in January, once he realized and got these notices from the public health folks, asked all of the units on the 31st to search for unexplained pneumonia cases, and 2 were found. It turned out the first lived around the hospital, but worked at the Huanan market. The second didn't work at the Huanan market, but had friends who did and who had visited his home. And so again, whether you're looking close to the market or far from the market, there's just this very, very curious pattern where the hospitals early on are filling up primarily with people who worked or had some connection to this one wildlife market. On the 3rd of January, 3 more were identified. They weren't linked, but they were all part of a single cluster. And so again, that snapshot early on is a very surprising density of cases linked to the Huanan market. if it hadn't actually started there. Okay, quickly, at the same time we published that paper on the sort of geography of the early cases, we also did a study using the 787 earliest genome sequences from the pandemic, almost all of them in China, and very many of them from Wuhan. And it turns out that when you look at an evolutionary tree of these viruses, you can see very clearly these two early lineages that circulated, and this was published before this paper. This was an observation that had already been made, but essentially there was one lineage that started. This is the ancestor of all these lineage A cases, and these viruses here are 1, 2, 3 mutations away from that ancestor. Viruses that only are 1 unit away or 1 mutation away. And then there's this lineage B, which is separated from lineage A by 2 mutations or 2 substitutions. And it turns out that that pattern of seeing this kind of lineage that gives off a whole bunch of descendants from the ancestral version of it, and another one that's very large and also gives rise to a whole bunch of descendants that that spread independently from it, because each of these represent on the vertical axis different mutations. It turns out that there's this is actually not current. It's more like a 97% probability that there were 2 jumps of this virus into humans, because you just don't see this kind of pattern very often at all if the virus started with just a single entry into humans. You just don't see this huge, what's called a polytomy here, lots of descendants from this ancestor, and a big polytomy here, lots of descendants from the lineage B ancestor, and have those separated by 2 substitutions. Even more importantly, and I won't really show it here, but the molecular clock doesn't really make sense under a single origin of what is most likely to be the ancestor of both lineage A and B. Lineage A is more like the bat viruses that we find. Lineage B at these 2 mutations is different than the bat virus that we think, bat viruses that are the ultimate source of these. And so basically, if the virus started here with an ancestor of lineage A, over the same time period, these lineage A ones have only made it about this many mutations from that, whereas the lineage B ones have made it several more mutations. And I don't want to get into the weeds here, but essentially that tells you that this does not fit with a single origin, because all of them should have made it to about the same point if they're evolving after a single introduction. Okay, so now back to a little bit of what we published in the paper that also looked at the residential location data. And it turned out that the China CDC, right when the market was closed early on January 1st, and then again on January 12th, and then again right up until March a couple of times, went in and swabbed samples from various surfaces, things like the floor or the wall of a stall that sells vegetables, which you would expect to just be, if there's any SARS-CoV-2 positive samples there, to be related to human infections there. But also things like animal carts or carts used for moving animal cages, a cage itself that was positive for SARS-CoV-2. And what we found was that there was a significant pattern where those environmental positives were in the same area of the market that we were able to piece together was where the wildlife was mostly sold, which was the southwest corner of the western section of the market. And here is a more detailed map showing these different stalls. And there was one stall here in particular that had both a very high proportion out of the samples that were taken in that stall that were positive for the virus, but also they were taken from stalls that one of my co-authors, Eddie Holmes, had noticed in 2014, long before the pandemic. He'd been taken there by his Chinese hosts as an example of where pandemic potential pathogens might circulate. And he snapped this photo of raccoon dogs in the same stall that turns out to be really unusual amongst all the stalls in the market in terms of its environmental sort of signal of SARS-CoV-2. And in fact, our Chinese colleagues have now published a paper in Nature confirming that, yes, raccoon dogs were at this stall and several others, and quite a few other potential intermediate hosts were there as well. This is another photo that Eddie took of one of these animals over this open grate drainage system that exists throughout the market. Okay, so very, very briefly, I want to take you through a little bit more of the information that really points very strongly to something being unusual about the association with early cases and the Wuhan market. So reported cases, retrospective PCR. This last one here is seroprevalence of SARS-CoV-2 that was taken after a test for the antibodies of the virus was designed. Again, the seroprevalence, although it's not the very highest in the Wuhan market, in the general area north of the river, it is higher than other parts, like near the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And this one here is an interesting one that I was able to get data from Chinese colleagues who had been looking at cell phone records of people who called into or used an app that was designed early on in the outbreak for people who wanted more information about their symptoms if they might have COVID. And so with the cell phone data, which comes from later, January and February for the most part in 2020, than the case data in December, you see this shift from the case data is telling you a very clear story that early cases, including ones that had no link to the market and were not collected in a systematic way that should falsely give you that link, were clustered around and near to the market. But by January and February, that pattern shifts so that the density of cases, or at least putative cases based on people using the app and trying to figure out why they are having trouble breathing and so forth, shifts away from the Wuhan market into other areas, and it sort of more just reflects the density of the population in the city. Okay, so it's become a commonplace for people to say, well, you know, this must have come from China because China is trying to, or this must have come from a lab in China because they're not sharing any data, and that's obviously because they're hiding the lab origin of the outbreak. So it turns out that almost all of the information that I've talked about so far and the data that we've used in these papers actually does come from Chinese scientists primarily, from early on in the outbreak. And it is true that China, a few months after the outbreak was recognized, they really did start to clamp down on any information that could connect the pandemic as a whole to China, whether that had to do with releasing information from the Wuhan Institute of Virology or information that might have pointed in the direction of the market. The unfortunate thing, if they are indeed trying to do that so that they can say, hey, we don't even know this virus came from China. It may have come from, Italy, because there were a bunch of cases in January and February in Italy, and maybe that's how the virus got to the Wuhan market in the first place. But the cat was in a way already out of the bag and hidden in plain sight in the WHO report in these maps of where residential location, the residential locations of early cases, for example, and other things. But even after that, it's not true that China has completely closed off the release of information. And so one of the things that a lot of us were hoping for was that Chinese scientists would go back and look at blood donor samples that had been stored and collected from September until December of 2019. And so our results all pointed very clearly, when you spend a lot of time and look at all of the different things that are pointing to the market and to the Wuhan market being the source of both of the early lineages, which you don't expect if it was just a later super spreading event of a virus that was already circulating widely in the city. So we had very little doubt that we didn't think that many, if any, of those samples would turn out to show evidence of people having been infected with SARS-CoV-2 September to December of 2019, because there are so many indications, including the molecular clock, that shows that the ancestor of all of these viruses probably existed in late November. We didn't expect any of these tens of thousands of samples, if they were eventually tested, to reveal, that we were wrong and there were just, cases all over the city and a high prevalence, indicating that the outbreak had been going on a long time before the Wuhan market was hit. And so recently, Chang et al. Did release their work on these tens of thousands of cases of patient samples, 32,000 blood donors. And some of them did show SARS-specific antibodies, but at the rate that you expect false positives when you're not using a particularly specific serological antibody assay that sometimes can throw up a positive even though the person only has antibodies to some other related virus. And it turns out when you look at what are called neutralizing antibodies, very, very potent antibodies that can protect from infection and typically represent a true mark of having been infected by that specific virus. Not a single one of those 32,484 blood donors showed evidence of this virus up until December. So now I just want to end by going through some of the misconceptions, sometimes repeated as misinformation when people don't understand the real background, often spread as disinformation by people who are intentionally putting out information that they know to be untrue because they have some desire for various reasons to argue that this was a lab leak. And so here's one. So the lab leak hypothesis has not been investigated. You hear this very often. And the fact is that after co-authoring and indeed proposing the idea that a group of us scientists who were open to this idea put out in Science magazine saying, listen, let's take this seriously until we have more evidence. After that letter was published in mid-2021, I actually did do a lot of work to try to take this seriously, as you've seen in this talk. I tried my darndest to falsify the idea that it came from Wuhan market, first by showing that, oh, the only reason a bunch of the early cases were reported to work there is because that's the only place where people were looking. Not true. And then to look at the geographical pattern of cases who were not epidemiologically linked to the market to see if maybe they pointed to another location or were just so widespread that that it looked more like the market was just an event that took place after the virus was well established. And both of those things are not true. And so this is actually really not true. The way that you investigate something is you try to falsify it or falsify the competing hypothesis. And I've spent a lot of time, and my colleagues have, doing that. Here's another one. The only reason that so many of the early COVID cases were people who worked at the market was because that's, okay, we've covered that. That's not true. So we don't have strong evidence of when, where, and how this pandemic originated. And this is sort of the most commonly stated received wisdom about the pandemic. And it's just not true. Scientifically, we have, in many ways, much stronger evidence of when, where, and how this pandemic originated than any pandemic in history. We have the fact that it's linked to one of only 4 places that sold the sorts of intermediate hosts that we absolutely expect this kind of virus to emerge from. We have evidence showing that that market did sell these animals, and again, recently our Chinese colleagues themselves, although they concluded that it's probably humans that brought this virus to the market, we have genetic evidence of a zoo full of potential intermediate hosts having been at that market, including in the very stall that had effectively the highest level of environmental positives in the whole market. We don't have that for HIV. We don't have that for Spanish flu. We don't even have that for the 2009 pandemic influenza. And so it should not be forgotten that because of the research that was done early on, we have an incredible snapshot of the unfolding of what became a pandemic that in those ways is unlike anything else we've ever had in history. And the fact that people argue that, okay, well, maybe I'll get onto this in a second. Oh, this is it. Yeah, the idea that, okay, well, they haven't found an animal at the Wuhan market that was infected with the progenitor of the virus. True, but essentially no live animals of the species that we think are likely hosts, intermediate hosts, were actually sampled there. They sampled some live mammals, but they were things like rats that had been trapped in the market, rabbits, stray dogs, stray cats, the fact is that very few animals at all that were even conceivably potential hosts were tested, and those were frozen and in very, very low numbers, and did not include key species like raccoon dogs and civets. Raccoon dogs in particular, because they're one of the only potential hosts that has been shown to be not only susceptible to infection, but able to transmit the virus. Same thing goes for the lack of finding an infected animal on a farm. Well, the farms, unlike the first SARS outbreak, where the farms remained open for months and months and months, and eventually animals were found, including in Hubei province, where Wuhan is, to be infected with relatives of the human SARS virus. In this case, the farms were liquidated very early in 2020 because of the concern of repeated spillovers. And so, again, it's true that we don't have the kind of connection that we do for something like SARS, the original SARS, where wildlife was found to have similar viruses. But we didn't have the chance in this case, and it's a real false and deceptive argument to say that this says anything against the market origin hypothesis. Let me just zoom to the end here because I'm going long. And I want to end with two things. Okay, so I want to address the idea that is often put out there, I guess, by people who either really just don't understand the evidence that we have for the original SARS, or they do understand it and they're trying to take other people in. But this idea, okay, that there's something strange and unnatural about the long distance between the currently known closest relatives of SARS-CoV-2 in bats, which are from southern China, and the location of Wuhan, which is quite far away. So here's Yunnan, where fragments of the genome of the virus of these bats are the closest thing to SARS-CoV-2. And it is a long way. But here's where SARS-1 emerged. And it turns out that its closest relatives in bats were also in Yunnan province. And there's really no substantial difference. And so unless you want to argue that SARS-1 must have been a lab leak as well because of the distance between the ultimate reservoir and the site of emergence, you probably shouldn't, if you have integrity, do the same thing for SARS-CoV-2. And finally, this is a big one, and this is kind of where things started for me, which is this feeling that, well, I know that there was a lab that studied coronaviruses, including so-called Sarbeco viruses, which are the SARS-related viruses that SARS-1 and SARS-2 belong to. And so isn't it a crazy coincidence that of all places on Earth for a SARS-related pandemic to start, it's in the place that has this lab? And again, initially I thought, okay, that is why we need to take this quite seriously. But then, as I say, along the way, a whole lot of other things showed that the coincidence of this thing emerging apparently in one of only 4 locations in the huge city that sold these sorts of animals and other things, those were even weirder coincidences. But then I learned through research with collaborators like Joel Wertheim and Jonathan Pekar that, again, it takes a city for this virus to emerge. You do not, our simulations showed that if you took a virus with the properties of the early variants of SARS-CoV-2 and you dropped it instead of into a city of 12 million people, a a village where there's perhaps a farm, a civet farm, where the virus is circulating and it jumps into someone there, there's about a 99% chance that it will just go extinct each time it jumps into a human. So you really expect this to emerge in a city. And it turns out when you spread out your perspective and look at this, almost every top 10 city, for example, in China that you look at, after the fact, if the virus had emerged there through wildlife, you would have people saying, well, there's a lab that studies coronaviruses there, so it must have come from that lab. Beijing has 3 labs that you could point to after the fact. Other cities had labs that actually isolated closely related viruses from pangolins, for example, which didn't happen at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so, the intuition is perfectly fine. Crazy coincidence that there's a lab in this city that studies these viruses, but actually, when you spread out your perspective, you realize that in many of the other places that a virus that needs a big city to emerge, there were labs that you could point to after the fact as crazy coincidences. The Wuhan coincidence starts to look much less persuasive. And with that, I will just point out that misunderstandings about all of what I've talked to tonight has led to a situation where 2/3 of Americans say it's definitely or probably true that this virus did originate in a laboratory in China. And it's not just a US thing, that a poll of 36 countries around the world found that every single country except for Denmark, the majority of people in each of those countries does think it comes from a lab. And there's rarely been a disconnect this large between the scientific evidence, which is replete with scientific publications that point to this wildlife market. And there's lots of them, and there are no scientific publications that support the idea that this came from a lab. And it matters because right now the world is spending a ton of time talking about lab safety, which is good. But you don't hear a lot of people saying this thing almost certainly started with wildlife being taken live into the heart of big cities. What are we going to do about that? And so hopefully this talk has made that case, and I thank you.
And we thank you also. That was fantastic and fascinating. I think I saw a lot of very appreciative comments coming in, and I'm sure you'll have a chance to look through those when we're done here. But that was good. Really great.
And it was
one
really
thing
long.
that
sorry.
There's a lot to cover here, and so yeah, we're gonna open it up for questions. And I know Jay's in the comments there, sorting through them and finding good ones. But I want to just start off. You skipped past something that I want to touch on at least.
Yeah.
Because I know I think from what I've read, for you and certainly for other scientists who are now advocates of the zoonotic hypothesis,
I'm not an advocate of that hypothesis.
Well, yeah, I'm always cautious about the word advocate. But
yeah.
a proponent.
I'm not for a hypothesis. I'm for evidence.
Proponent of that as the best explanation for the available evidence.
That's fair. Absolutely. Yeah. It's hands down the best.
Yeah, no, it's important to be clear about that. But that you and many other people who now take that stance were initially, as you said, open to the idea that there may have been a lab origin. And one of the things, and in intelligence assessments that have been somewhat released, it seems like the intelligence community is at least still open to that. And one of the things that people point to, and you touched on this, I saw the slide, but you skipped past it, is some of the molecular evidence, distinct from the geographical evidence base that you've been talking about, which to me is also really compelling. But I think attitudes also shifted about some of that molecular evidence. And I just wondered if you wanted to take a second to just address what the basis is for that. Because if there were molecular evidence for a lab origin, the geography almost wouldn't matter, right?
And
if we knew that it was in if we knew that it was in WIV, and that someone there got sick because it spilled over from a bat that they swabbed the butt, it doesn't matter what the pattern of early cases would be if we just had the absolute,
if we knew that
positive
for sure
about the lab. So if the molecular evidence were compelling in that way, so just to sort of give clarity to people who are catching up on this, do you want to give a brief summary of sort of what we know on that front?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. The main thing, there's two things that people have pointed to as this has got to be a lab origin because of this and because of this. One of them is this idea that the spike protein, and in particular so the spike protein is on the outside of the virus. It's the part that has to dock on a human cell so that the virus eventually can spit its genomic material into that cell and turn it into a factory for making new SARS-CoV-2 virions.
It's all the little red dots in the pictures that you see of
that's right.
Viruses, right. Yeah.
And on that spike protein, there's a part called the receptor binding domain, which is the part that is key to that docking on the receptor that this virus uses to get into our cells, which is on the human side is called the ACE2. And the initial argument was this is impossibly good at getting into our cells because it binds so well to ACE2 that it must have been cooked up in a lab. And it turns out that sampling viruses after the pandemic emerged has now shown that viruses with similarly human adapted spike proteins exist in bats in Laos, for example. And so that just turned out to be not the case at all. And also we've seen the virus spike protein obviously adapt tremendously over the years of the pandemic. So it was not some perfect human designed virion for getting into human cells. And it also, white-tailed deer all over the North America are infected with this virus. It's jumped into mink farms on multiple occasions. It's jumped into hamsters in pet stores. It's transmissible in raccoon dogs. This is a generalist virus. It's not something that was designed to get into humans. And the other one is this thing called the furin cleavage site, which is in this virus. If you line it up against its closest relatives and you look at the amino acids, which are the components of its proteins, it has a stretch where there are several amino acids that are what we call an insertion. They aren't present in the other close relatives in bats and pangolins, but they're present in the human virus. And so people have pointed to that and said, well, that's the fingerprint of genetic engineering to make a better virus designed to that is better at transmitting in humans. And so some of my colleagues were initially, and this has been sort of leaked by Congress, their communications in a way that is just outrageous and an attack on science and scientists that is just unbelievable. But they thought that too originally, and it tweaked their interests. And then, very soon after that, they talked to people who spend their whole careers studying coronaviruses, who pointed out that, for example, we've all been infected by cold-causing coronaviruses that you don't hear too much about, but there are 4 other coronaviruses that have been circulating in humans for decades before this one. And one of them, OC43, for example, has a furin cleavage site that looks in many ways very, very similar to this virus's furin cleavage site. That was clearly natural. And no one in 2019 could have known how to actually create a virus that would actually be effective, a more effective transmitter in humans. And this, so this idea that, it's also important to point out that this furin cleavage site is not a very good furin cleavage site, and the way it's inserted is not a way that any sensible person would insert a furin cleavage site. And
it's
so,
not a product of intelligent design, is what you're.
To
borrow a topic
if
that
it were
skeptics will
human
be familiar
designed,
with.
it would be a product of unintelligent design.
Yeah.
And so, to the extent that that furin cleavage site actually has contributed to this becoming a pandemic virus, it's almost a sort of facepalm situation where, okay, these viruses cross into humans every day, but for 20 years since the first SARS, none of them has had what it takes to be a successful human pathogen. So of course, the viruses that pass through that sieve and are the 1 in a zillion that actually are able to spread in humans are going to have some features that set them apart from all of the other viruses in bats or intermediate hosts that didn't have those. And the furin cleavage site is obviously that. And it's just a lack of appreciation for the ability of evolution to come up with things that are adaptive.
Yeah, people don't appreciate Orgel's second law that evolution is always smarter than you are.
Yeah. Okay, so I see a question from Les Fabi, who asks, what are the chances a future pandemic will start with a live wildlife market again? This is a $70 billion annual business just in China. Can it be stopped or made safe? Okay, so one bit of good news is that the sales of live wildlife in China have actually plummeted since the pandemic started. But it's still going on, and it's going on outside of China in the ways that it has for a long time. So that is the huge risk, and it absolutely is going to happen again if we don't minimize that risk. It's this combination of taking a virus that has what it takes, and instead of leaving it in a rural part of a country where even if it does jump into someone, it's unlikely to keep spreading, taking that into the heart of a huge city in a live animal that can be spewing out viral particles in a lab, or sorry, in a place that sells these sorts of animals, which all of this operates at biosafety level 0. To me, the lesson here is that is far and away the way that is most likely to cause the next pandemic. That said, absolutely, we need to learn every reasonable lesson we can about lab safety. But there too, what's happening is a lot of people who don't understand how this work is done in the lab are throwing the baby out with the bathwater, to the point where if they get their way, a lot of really standard, extremely low risk work is going to be stopped. Sampling of viruses out in the wild from things like bats is going to be stopped, and that is going to make us more vulnerable. So one thing, for example, I'm working on right now is a vaccine that will protect against all sarbecoviruses, all SARS-related viruses that you can give to people so that it will block the next one from actually being able to transmit. And if it does, block people from filling up hospitals and a mass death event. That work relies entirely on samples that have yielded SARS-related viruses in the natural world. If we didn't have that, we would have no idea how to make a vaccine that would protect against that full range of diversity. And so these are the things that are really concerning to me, that we're actually potentially going to overcorrect and not do things in a nuanced way that really homes in on the big risks without creating new ones. Okay, so I see rephrasing a question from Peter M. What's the state of the Huanan market today? Is it open? Are people still using it? It is closed as a seafood and live animal market, and shuttered. It also had a floor that sold eyeglasses, and for all I know, that is still open. But by and large, it's shut down. I don't know about, I think the other 3 live animal markets are probably shut down, but that's the kind of thing that would be interesting to know. Howard Winnett asks, do any current epidemiological models predict an annual cycling for this coronavirus, similar to that of influenza viruses? It's definitely taking a long time to settle into a seasonal cycle, if it is going to. Other coronaviruses that circulate are very seasonal, with late in the year peaks for 2 of them, and then early, and so basically November, December for 2 of them are the peaks, and then February, March for 2 of them are the peaks. What this virus keeps doing is throwing up substantial new variants that sort of reset the rules of the game every time that they evolve. And so we'll see. My guess is that long term, at least in terms of the Northern Hemisphere that we're used to thinking about, that it will settle into more of a winter seasonal pattern, but I don't know. I can't say. Okay, Jay Diamond asks, you used p-value as a metric of likelihood that the pandemic started away from the wet market. Can you give those not familiar with statistics an idea of how probable or not probable that is? Sure, yeah. So again, when you test a hypothesis, what you're really doing is saying, okay, I've got a pattern in the data that I'm looking at. One possibility is that this pattern, in this case of the earliest reported cases tending geographically to be really connected to this one particular site. What you're always testing with the p-value is saying, okay, sure, there might be a bit of a pattern there, fine. But what are the chances that you could observe that, even if that pattern actually wasn't really true if you had access to all of the data, and it's just something with your little sample that happened to on the occasion that on this occasion a lot more cases just happened to live near the market, and so basically what it's saying is, given what we know about the data, you could only explain this as a coincidence about if you sort of reran the epidemic over and over again, you'd only see that kind of association with the Wuhan market less than 1 out of 1,000 times that you reran the epidemic. And for science, that's extremely strong evidence. That is, we never deal with proofs. Proof is for mathematics. So technically, you always you can't absolutely say something did or didn't happen. But what you can do is give this idea of how plausible it is. Anything's possible. Any scenario essentially that you could make up is possible. But those low p-values, and more importantly, the huge amount of evidence, whether you look at human epidemiology, the antibody tests of the blood that was taken in those late months in Wuhan, the fact that of all places in Wuhan, the place where excess mortality and the statistics of people dying happens to occur right around the Wuhan market. The very low likelihood of all sites being hit hard earliest, it would be one of 4 places that sell the kinds of animals that that we know bring these viruses into the human population. All of that, if this was any other question and any other virus, we would not be having a discussion about whether it's plausible that, okay, someone got infected at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Even though it's an asymptomatic virus for most people, they didn't infect anyone else that they worked with. And then when they did go somewhere, of all the places, tens of thousands of places in a city that size that they might go and actually start a chain of infection, they made a beeline to the largest of only 4 wildlife markets. And in all likelihood, 2 weeks later, some other person at the lab got infected, didn't leave any trace of that infection in that part of town, and made a beeline again over to the same area of this market, where we see the earliest cases being found in that same area of the market where the live wildlife was sold. Shaker Heights channel. Is there a book you recommend where we can read about the subject of COVID origins or COVID in general? Yeah, David Quammen has written a book called Breathless. That is the one that I would recommend, and not just because it covers some of my own work. It's a really nice perspective on what a bunch of people were doing, not just in terms of origins, but all of the science early on in the outbreak. So yeah, it's pretty good.
All right, well, it's coming right up on 9 o'clock, and this has been a really fascinating stretch, and we want to thank you so much. It's been great having you here, and thanks for answering folks' questions.
Thank you.
This is going to be online. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and I've seen people, like I said, just really appreciating you sharing all of your insights on this.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this, and thank you all for listening, who I can't see or hear. I know you're there.
And folks who enjoyed today can join us again next month, October 12th. We're going to be joined, our Eugenie Scott will be joined by Peter Hadfield, Potwiller 54 on YouTube. He's a scientist and science journalist and creator of the popular YouTube channel Potwiller 54. And through clips from the channel, Jeannie Scott and Hatfield will discuss his approach to his longtime production of science-related videos and the importance of outreach to the public to encourage critical thinking and accurate scientific knowledge. He's got over 230,000 subscribers and 32 million views, and is one of the most popular science-related sites on YouTube. So that should be a really fascinating talk. And I hope you'll be able to join us then. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next month.